On a quiet Tuesday night in Atlanta, Judge André Whitaker stopped for gas in a hoodie. Minutes later, two officers had him face down on cold metal, handcuffed like a criminal. What they didn't know, he was the most powerful man they could ever arrest. What happened next shocked the city and changed policing forever. Stay tuned, hit that subscribe button like this video, and share it to spread the truth. The night was supposed to be uneventful. After nearly 12 hours at Emory Hospital, Judge André Whitaker finally left his mother's bedside with a fragile sense of relief. At 68 years old, she had just made it through a difficult heart procedure. The doctors told him the operation went well, that she was stable, that he could go home. He had spent most of the day in that narrow hospital chair, still in the jeans and navy hoodie he'd pulled on that morning. Comfort mattered more than appearances in those waiting rooms, with their humming fluorescent lights and steady chorus of beeping monitors. By the time André slid behind the wheel of his silver BMW, it was almost 10:30 at night. His mind was foggy, running on adrenaline and black coffee, not on rest. The digital display on his dashboard glowed red, reminding him the tank was nearly empty. With a sigh, he pulled onto Ponce de Leon Avenue and into a SoCo station on the edge of a mostly white suburb just northeast of Atlanta. The station sat beneath harsh halogen lights that made the cracked pavement shine like glass. The air smelled faintly of fried food drifting from the nearby diner. A single pickup idled on the far side, its driver sipping a soda. Otherwise, the lot was quiet. André parked at pump number 3. The chill in the air cut through his hoodie as he stepped out, swiping his card and inserting the nozzle into the tank. The pump hummed as fuel flowed, and for a moment he allowed himself to drift. He thought of his mother's frail hand gripping his when she woke up after surgery. He thought of the files stacked high in his office, downtown cases, waiting to be heard. And he thought of his kids, Malik and Sarai, probably still awake at home, scrolling on their phones. That's when he noticed it. A pair of headlights circling the perimeter of the lot, slow, deliberate. A black and white police cruiser gliding like a shark through shallow water. The vehicle moved past the pickup, paused for half a beat, then looped toward the pumps. The hairs on the back of André's neck rose. He'd seen that look before, officers scanning for prey, not help. Inside the cruiser sat officers Brett Kincaid and Owen Mercer, both in their early 30s, both known around their precinct for numbers. High arrest counts, frequent stops, the kind of stats that earned nods from supervisors and quiet groans from defense attorneys. Kincaid, with his square jaw and close-cropped blonde hair, leaned forward, eyes narrowing as he studied André at the pump. Mercer, thinner, darker-haired, with a permanent frown etched into his face, adjusted the radio before muttering, "Matches the description from last week's Wawa robbery." Kincaid smirked. "Black male, hoodie, medium build. That's all we need." It was the oldest line in the book, a description so vague it could apply to thousands of men across Atlanta on any given night. But in their world, it was enough. More than enough. André saw the cruiser swing in behind him, blocking the narrow exit lane. His pulse quickened. He had read hundreds of police reports as a judge heard hundreds of testimonies, each beginning with the same harmless detail: a stop, a question, a routine check. He knew how quickly those moments turned ugly. He had even warned his own children about it. Keep your hands visible. Don't argue. Ask permission before moving. Say yes, sir, and no, sir. And now, at 51 years old, he was living the exact scenario he'd spent a career adjudicating. The cruiser doors opened in near unison. Kincaid stepped out first, his boots crunching on the asphalt, hand already resting on his holstered weapon. Mercer followed a beat later, posture rigid, eyes fixed on André as though he were a cornered animal. André's grip on the fuel nozzle tightened. He pulled it free, replaced it in the cradle, and calmly screwed his gas cap into place. Every move slow, deliberate. He turned to face them, lifting his chin slightly. "Good evening, officers," he said, his voice even. "Is there a problem?" Kincaid stopped a few feet away, widening his stance. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area. Mind telling us what you're doing here?" André blinked, incredulous. The pump still ticked behind him, the receipt fluttering from the slot. "Getting gas," he answered simply. Mercer stepped closer. "ID. Now." André kept his voice calm. "May I ask why I'm just leaving the hospital?" "My mother had surgery today." Kincaid's jaw tightened. "You match the description of a suspect. Hood up, medium build. You fit." A dry laugh almost escaped André's lips. Instead, he steadied his breath. "Blackmail," he said softly. "That's the description, isn't it?" Both officers bristled. Mercer's hand shifted on his belt. The space between them seemed to shrink. André raised his palms slightly, his voice low and measured. "I'm reaching for my wallet," he announced, turning slowly toward his back pocket. "My name is André Whitaker. I'm a judge with Fulton County." The words hung in the air like a warning flare, but Kincaid only chuckled. "Sure you are. And I'm the governor." Before André could retrieve his wallet, Kincaid lunged, grabbing his arm and slamming him chest first against the side of the BMW. The cold metal bit into his cheek. The pump nozzle clattered to the ground. "What are you doing?" André's voice strained against the sudden force. "Stop resisting!" Kincaid barked, yanking his arms back. "I'm not resisting," André replied, gritting his teeth. The steel cuffs snapped around his wrists, too tight, cutting into skin. Mercer hovered close, his hand never straying far from his weapon. "We'll check your story downtown," he muttered, patting André's pockets roughly. A woman's voice cut through the tension. "Is this really necessary?" Across the lot, a young white woman at pump number 5 held up her phone recording. The small red light blinked in the dark, documenting every second. "Ma'am, step back," Mercer ordered, not looking at her. "Police business." Inside the convenience store, Mr. Baunguyen, the middle-aged manager with tired eyes, rushed outside. "Officers, I know this man," he pleaded, pointing at André. "He's a regular here. He's a judge." "Return inside before you interfere with police business," Kincaid snapped, shoving André toward the cruiser. André twisted his head, locking eyes with Nguyen. His voice was calm, almost too calm for the moment. "Please call Diane Chen at the courthouse. Tell her what's happening." Nguyen nodded frantically, backing away. The cuffs dug deeper into André's wrists as Mercer shoved his head down, forcing him into the back seat like a dangerous criminal. The door slammed shut. The world outside blurred through the glass. His BMW sat abandoned by the pump gas cap, dangling receipt fluttering in the wind. As the cruiser rolled out of the lot, André sat in stunned silence. The humiliation pressed heavier than the cuffs, heavier than the concrete he knew awaited him at the station. He'd spent his career defending the system, believing in its promise of fairness. But tonight, dressed not in robes, but in a hoodie, he was reduced to nothing more than a target, a man who fit a description. The irony carved into him like stone. A judge of Fulton County stripped of his dignity in less than 5 minutes on a Tuesday night. And as the blue lights strobed across the quiet Atlanta streets, André knew one truth above all: this story was far from over. The back seat of the cruiser smelled faintly of sweat and disinfectant, a cage on wheels disguised as a patrol car. Judge André Whitaker sat with his wrists shackled behind him, the steel cutting deeper with every bump in the road. The cuffs weren't just tight, they were punitive, deliberately cinched by Officer Brett Kincaid until his circulation pulsed against the metal. André had once signed off on cases where defendants described this exact sensation. The bite of steel meant not to restrain, but to humiliate. Now he was living it. Outside Atlanta's late-night traffic blurred into streaks of red and white. The gas station shrank in the distance, the silver BMW he'd bought 10 years earlier, sitting abandoned under buzzing halogen lamps. The receipt from pump number 3 had fluttered free, and now tumbled across the lot a forgotten piece of paper. Telling the truth, he'd been buying gas, nothing more. Up front, the officers' voices carried back like they were discussing groceries, not a human being. "Got another one claiming to be somebody important," Kincaid said, smirking as he adjusted the rearview mirror to glance at his captive. "Last week, it was a guy swearing he was the mayor's cousin." Mercer chuckled, his voice lower, more cautious. "That woman who said she was a neurosurgeon. Remember her? Turned out she had 3 warrants." The words stung not because they doubted him, but because they were so practiced. This was a routine for them. Reduce the person in cuffs to a liar, a cliché, just another body for their arrest tally. André leaned back against the seat, forcing his breath to slow. He'd read enough reports, presided over enough trials to know where this could spiral. He'd seen "stop resisting" written in ink to justify bruises, seen furtive movements used to excuse violence. He had spoken those words aloud from the bench, denying motions for dismissal when evidence wasn't strong enough to override officer testimony. He had told himself then that the law was neutral, that procedure mattered more than perception. Now, he wasn't so sure. The cruiser pulled into a squat brick building, the Abington Precinct station house lights glaring against the night sky. The rear gate buzzed open, iron bars clanging like a prison yard. They parked near the booking entrance, away from public eyes. The door jerked open. Out Mercer barked, pulling André by the elbow. The cuffs dug deeper. He stumbled but caught himself refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing him fall. Inside, the booking area glowed with the same sterile fluorescent lights as the hospital he'd left barely 2 hours earlier. But this room smelled of stale coffee and sweat, not healing. The sergeant at the desk didn't even glance up at first, his fingers clattering on a keyboard. "Got a gas station loiterer," Kincaid announced, pushing André forward. "Matches description of last week's Wawa robbery. Claims he's a judge." The last sentence landed like a joke, eliciting chuckles from 2 uniformed officers nearby. The sergeant finally looked up. Heavy-set, thinning hair eyes, half-lidded from too many years behind that desk. He scanned André quickly, as though assessing a stranger's groceries, then returned to his screen. "Name." André straightened his shoulders, refusing to let his voice waver. "André Whitaker. I am a judge with Fulton County. I demand my phone call immediately." The sergeant didn't flinch. "Sure you are. Empty your pockets." André's wrists still bound behind him, he lifted them slightly. "I cannot empty my pockets while restrained. And under Georgia statute, I am entitled to a phone call upon booking." The room stilled for half a beat. His calm assertion of rights, delivered with the gravity of the bench, unsettled them. The sergeant stood, his bulk casting a shadow. "Look, buddy, this goes a lot smoother if you cooperate. Empty your pockets. We'll take your prints. Then, maybe you get your call." Kincaid stepped forward, releasing the cuffs with a rough twist. The relief of freedom was immediate, but bitter. André rubbed his wrists as the blood returned, the skin already raw. Now, the sergeant said flatly, "Empty your pockets." One by one, André placed his belongings on the counter. Wallet, keys, phone, hospital parking receipt, a half-eaten roll of mints. The sergeant opened the wallet, flipping through the cards. Driver's license, credit cards, health insurance. Then the state-issued judicial ID embossed with the seal of Georgia. The sergeant barely paused before setting it aside. Shoes and belt. André complied, standing in socks on the cold tile. With every item removed, he felt another layer of dignity stripped away. This was the ritual of booking deconstruction of a person into an object a body to be processed. From the corner of his eye movement, a young black officer entering with a coffee cup. He glanced at André, then froze. His eyes widened. Judge Whitaker. The room paused. André turned his head. The face was familiar. Yes, officer? And you are? Darius Cole, sir. You gave a lecture at the Academy last year. Constitutional rights during arrests. His voice trembled. I know him. He's a judge. The sergeant's posture shifted ever so slightly, discomfort flickering across his features. He picked up the judicial ID again, looking closer this time. The seal glared back at him in undeniable gold. Through the glass wall, Captain Harold Dwyer emerged from his office, tall, salt-and-pepper hair, the kind of man who thrived in press conferences, but not patrol cars. His face dropped when he saw André standing barefoot, belongings strewn across the counter. "Judge Whitaker," he said, quickly adopting a tone oozing with artificial warmth. "There seems to have been a terrible misunderstanding." André met his gaze coldly. "Indeed, Captain. A misunderstanding of constitutional rights, proper police procedure, and basic human dignity." Behind him, Kincaid and Mercer stiffened. The smirk drained from Kincaid's face, replaced by a flicker of unease. Mercer's jaw clenched, sweat beading at his temple. The captain gestured awkwardly. "Let's get your items back to you. Can I offer you coffee?" "My office?" "No," André interrupted, voice firm. "I prefer to follow proper procedure. I am entitled to a phone call." The sergeant shifted again, now furiously typing, perhaps documenting, perhaps covering himself. Around the room, whispers spread. The name had sunk in. A judge. They hadn't just arrested a black man in a hoodie, they had shackled one of the most respected figures in Fulton County. Captain Dwyer's mask of composure cracked for half a second. He pulled Kincaid and Mercer aside into his office, the glass walls revealing their frantic gesturing. They were already constructing a story, a justification. They always did. But André knew something they didn't. The video from the gas station was already online, already spreading. Officer Cole stood awkwardly near the desk, coffee forgotten, shifting his weight, as though deciding whether to speak again. His loyalty to the badge battled visibly with his respect for the man before him. In that tension, André saw both the danger and the possibility of change. When his phone was finally returned for the call, André dialed not his lawyer but Judge Diane Chen, the colleague who handled misconduct cases. He spoke slowly, every word measured. Knowing ears were straining all around him. As he talked, his mind replayed the arrest in slow motion, the smirk on Kincaid's face, the cold slam of metal against his cheek. The muffled plea of Mr. Bao Nguyen brushed aside like background noise. He thought of the young woman filming her phone, lifted like a shield of truth. He thought of his children, Malik and Sarai, and the painful realization he would soon have to tell them, even following every rule, even identifying himself, even declaring he was a judge. It hadn't mattered. His skin had been the only evidence they needed. André hung up, straightened his back, and looked around the booking room. He had come face to face with the machine he'd spent decades inside. And for the first time he saw it not from the bench, but from the floor. And that made all the difference. The concrete floor of the Abington Township precinct was colder than the cuffs had been. Judge André Whitaker stood barefoot in his socks belt, stripped away his belongings scattered across a metal counter like evidence. He felt less like a man, less like a judge, and more like an object being processed by a machine. The sergeant behind the desk, the kind with thinning hair and permanent scowl, hadn't looked up from his computer when Whitaker identified himself. He'd only grunted, "Empty your pockets," as though words like constitutional rights or judicial ID meant nothing at all. Whitaker's voice was steady, but inside his chest, his heartbeat thundered. "I am entitled to a phone call," he reminded them. His tone carried the same authority he used in court, when lawyers rambled or witnesses drifted. Yet here, in this fluorescent box, the sound fell flat, absorbed by indifference. Sergeant Boyle finally looked up, his lip curling. "You'll get your call once we're done. Cooperate, and this goes faster." Kincaid smirked nearby, leaning against the wall like a man proud of his hunt. Mercer, less sure of himself, kept shifting his weight, eyes flicking toward the exit, as though calculating escape routes from his own actions. They'd brought him in thinking he was just another black man in a hoodie. They had no idea who they had dragged through the door. The cuffs came off with a harsh twist. Relief in his wrists came quickly, but the sting of humiliation did not. One by one, Whitaker placed his belongings on the counter: wallet, keys, phone, a hospital parking stub, a roll of mints worn down from hours in sterile waiting rooms. Boyle thumbed through the wallet lazily until the gold-embossed seal of Georgia gleamed under the harsh light. He stared at it for half a second before tossing it aside. "Shoes?" he barked. Whitaker complied, standing in his socks, feeling the chill seep up through his bones. He imagined the countless men and women who had stood on this same spot, stripped of dignity, piece by piece, many without the education, position, or voice he had. He had heard their stories in his courtroom, but had he really understood them until now? The door buzzed open with a sharp metallic crack. A younger officer walked in, carrying a styrofoam cup of coffee. Tall, lean, not more than mid-20s. His eyes swept the room casually until they landed on Whitaker. He froze mid-stride, coffee trembling in his hand. "Judge Whitaker." His voice cracked the silence like a gunshot. The room stiffened. Kincaid's smirk faltered. Mercer blinked. Boyle frowned, irritated. Whitaker turned his head, squinting. The face was familiar, but the name didn't come at once. "Officer Darius Cole, sir," the young man said, stepping forward. His voice carried a mixture of disbelief and recognition. "You lectured at the academy last spring. Constitutional arrests, limits on probable cause. I was in the front row." The room shifted, the air heavier now. Boyle reached for the wallet again, holding the ID card longer this time, his eyes narrowing on the seal he'd brushed aside moments earlier. "You know him?" Boyle demanded. "Yes, sir," Cole replied firmly. "That's Judge Whitaker of Fulton County." A silence followed that felt like a verdict. The fluorescent lights buzzed, the hum of a copier filled the corner, but no one moved. Even Kincaid, usually quick with his sarcasm, stared at the floor. From the far hallway, the heavy office door opened, and Captain Harold Dwyer appeared. Tall, polished hair silver at the temples, he looked like a man who spent more time at podiums than on patrol. He strode forward, but the moment he recognized Whitaker, his face dropped. Judge Whitaker, Dwyer said quickly, voice rich with false warmth. "What on earth? There seems to have been a terrible misunderstanding." Whitaker straightened shoulders, squared. His voice was calm, but each word cut like a blade. "Indeed, Captain. A misunderstanding of constitutional rights, proper police procedure, and basic human dignity." Behind him, the room shifted again. Mercer flinched, as though the words themselves were a blow. Kincaid's jaw hardened, but his eyes betrayed unease. They had pressed a man's face against his own BMW and cuffed him like a thief. Now they realized the man they'd shackled presided over courtrooms where their reports landed. Dwyer gestured awkwardly toward his office. "Let's get your belongings returned, have some coffee. We can talk." "No," Whitaker interrupted firmly. "I prefer proper procedure. I am entitled to a phone call. Nothing more, nothing less." The refusal rang louder than any shout. Boyle shifted uncomfortably behind his desk, suddenly interested in typing furiously at his computer, covering his tracks in a flurry of keystrokes. Through the glass of Dwyer's office, the captain yanked Kincaid and Mercer inside. Their silhouettes flailed in defensive gestures, arms crossed, voices rising through muted. The image was unmistakable. They were building a story, rehearsing their alibi, stitching together a narrative to protect themselves and the department. Whitaker had seen it 100 times from the bench. Tonight, he was watching it unfold from the floor. Officer Cole lingered near the desk, the weight of his loyalty tugging in two directions. His eyes darted toward Whitaker, then away. To speak further meant defying his department, but to stay silent meant betraying what he knew. Whitaker caught his gaze and gave the smallest nod, a recognition of courage not yet spoken. At last, the sergeant slid a desk phone across the counter, the cord coiled like a snake. "One call," he muttered. Whitaker picked it up, dialed slowly, deliberately. Not his lawyer, not his wife, but Judge Diane Chen, the colleague known for handling police misconduct cases. He described what had happened, voice steady, though inside he burned. He knew every word was being listened to, recorded in minds eager to twist it. So he spoke with precision, with the calm cadence of the courtroom, each detail measured. When he hung up, the room was different. The whispers had started. A judge. A sitting judge. Already the cracks in the blue wall were forming not from conscience, but from fear. Fear of exposure. Fear of accountability. Whitaker slipped his shoes back on his belt, returned wallet, and phone handed back in a plastic tray. But dignity could not be so easily restored. He glanced once more toward Dwyer's office, where Kincaid gestured wildly, Mercer nodding with pale face, and the captain pinched his brow with 2 fingers. As Whitaker pocketed his phone, it buzzed with new notifications. His heart sank. The video was online. Hundreds of shares. Thousands of views. Already viral. He hadn't even stepped out of the station, and the world beyond these walls knew what had happened. The irony wasn't lost on him. The blue wall they clung to inside these fluorescent halls was already crumbling outside, pixel by pixel, share by share. Officer Cole approached hesitantly. His voice was low but steady. "Sir, I'll drive you home if you'd like." Whitaker studied him, then nodded once. It wasn't just a ride. It was a signal there were still cracks where light could enter, still officers willing to stand on the right side of history. As they walked toward the door, the whispers followed, heavier than shackles. Captain Dwyer's voice rang faintly behind glass, sharp and urgent. "Get our story straight." The blue wall was holding for now, but Whitaker knew what they did not. Outside these walls, the truth was already moving faster than their lies could catch. By the time Judge André Whitaker walked through his own front door, the storm had already begun. It was just after midnight when Officer Darius Cole's patrol car eased out of his driveway, but inside the house, the atmosphere was anything but quiet. His phone had been buzzing without pause since the moment he left the precinct. Texts from colleagues, calls from reporters, emails from advocacy groups, push notifications stacking like falling bricks. But it wasn't until he saw his children's faces that he truly understood the scale of what had happened. Dad Malik's voice was tight with anger. His 17-year-old son stood in the living room, phone in hand screen glowing with the viral video. Behind him, Sarai, only 14, hovered in the hallway with wide eyes. On the muted television, a news anchor mouthed words beneath a banner that read, "Fulton County Judge arrested at gas station." Whitaker had been bracing himself for this, but seeing his children's fear stripped away the last of his composure. He set his wallet and keys on the entry table, opening his arms. Both kids rushed forward, clinging to him as if their embrace might erase what they'd seen. Over their heads, Vanessa emerged from the kitchen. She had been awake, of course. She always stayed up when he worked late. But tonight, she wasn't waiting with a smile. Her attorney's instincts burned behind her eyes, sharp and relentless. "Are you hurt?" she asked, scanning him like a client fresh from holding. Physically, no, he said, though the bruises on his wrists and the ache in his cheekbone told a harsher truth. They gathered on the sectional sofa. The television played the clip on repeat, grainy footage of Whitaker being slammed against his BMW. The words, "Stop resisting," echoing over his still body, the cuffs snapping around his wrists. Each loop was like a blade. Vanessa opened her laptop, already typing with fury. "We can file by morning. Emergency injunctive relief civil rights claim by noon. Michael at the ACLU owes me. They assaulted a sitting judge. This isn't just misconduct, André. This is systemic racism laid bare." He shook his head slowly. "Not yet." Her fingers froze over the keyboard. "Not yet, André. If we don't strike now when public outrage is highest, the department will close ranks. You know how this works. They're already writing their version of the story." He looked at her, then at his children. Malik's jaw was set hard, his fists clenched. Sarai leaned into his side, silent but trembling. "Do you remember the talk we had when you started driving?" he asked Malik softly. His son's voice came out automatic, like reciting a survival prayer. "Keep your hands visible. Don't make sudden movements. Say yes, sir, no, sir. Ask permission before reaching for anything." Sarai added almost in a whisper, "And always get their badge numbers." The pain in Whitaker's chest tightened. "I followed every one of those rules tonight. I was calm. I identified myself. I moved slow. I told them exactly what I was doing. And it didn't matter." Sarai lifted her head, eyes wet. "Because they didn't see a judge. They just saw a black man." He closed his eyes, hearing in her words the bitter truth he'd been forced to live only hours earlier. His phone buzzed again, this time with a call. Chief Justice Harriman's name flashed across the screen. Whitaker excused himself to his study, shutting the door behind him. André Whitaker just saw the footage. Harriman's voice was clipped furious. "This is outrageous. I've already called the commissioner and the mayor. They promise a full investigation." Whitaker sank into his leather chair, staring at the framed judicial oath hanging opposite his desk. "Administer justice, without respect to persons." The words, once ceremonial, now cut into him. "Thank you, Richard," he said. "Take some time off. I'll reassign your docket for the week," Harriman urged. "No," Whitaker answered. His voice was calm, steady, the same voice that commanded courtrooms. "I'll be on the bench tomorrow." There was a pause on the other end. "Are you sure no one would question you taking a few days?" "I'm sure. More than ever." When the call ended, he opened his laptop. Social media feeds overflowed with the clip. It had already passed 200,000 views. Hashtags multiplied. "Justice for Whitaker." "Catch your driving while black." "End racial profiling." Cable news ran segments dissecting the footage, panels of legal analysts debating its implications. Another call lit his phone. His mother voice, weak but fierce, from her hospital bed. "André, baby, are you all right?" "I'm fine, Mom. Please don't. Don't you dare tell me not to worry." Her voice sharpened, carrying the weight of decades. "I was marching in '65 before you were born. Some things never change." He closed his eyes. "No, they don't." When he returned to the living room, Vanessa was waiting with a cup of tea. Malik and Sarai had retreated upstairs, though their phones glowed beneath their blankets. She set the cup beside him, searching his face. "What are you planning?" He turned the laptop screen toward her. "Judge Sanderson called in sick. I've been assigned his docket for tomorrow." Her brows shot up, including the Abington misconduct hearing. He nodded once. "The same precinct, the same officers." Vanessa's jaw dropped. "André, I've checked the precedents. There's no absolute requirement for recusal. They'll file a motion, and I'll hear it. On the record. You know the police union will explode." "Let them," he said quietly. "For once, Let the system work the way it's supposed to. Upstairs, the hum of teenage voices drifted through the floorboards. He thought of his son's clenched fists, his daughter's trembling shoulders. He thought of the rules he had given them, rules that had failed him as surely as they had failed countless others. In the mirror, he saw the bruise darkening along his jaw. The image seared into his mind, his own face pressed against steel, his rights ignored, his dignity stripped. He had presided over countless men who told this same story. Tonight, it was his story too. And tomorrow morning at precisely 9 o'clock, he would carry that truth onto the bench. Morning came like a trial in itself. The Atlanta sky was still gray when Judge André Whitaker stepped through the courthouse's private entrance just after 8 o'clock. He wore his black robe folded neatly over one arm, the fabric heavier than it had ever felt before. Every hallway he walked seemed to hum with whispers. Clerks paused their work to glance at him. Attorneys lowered their voices as he passed. The viral video hadn't just entered people's news feeds, it had walked through the courthouse doors with him. In his chambers, sunlight filtered weakly through tall windows, catching the golden seal embossed on case files stacked high on his desk. His clerk, Sophia, slipped in with a file thicker than the rest. Judge Sanderson called out sick, she said. You've been rotated onto his docket. Whitaker took the folder, flipping the cover open. The title burned like a brand, Brooks vs. Atlanta North Precinct. The defendant's officers, Brett Kincaid and Owen Mercer. For a moment, he let the silence settle. Fate had drawn a straight, sharp line between last night's humiliation and today's responsibility. He could almost hear Vanessa's voice in his mind. The appearance of conflict will be the first thing they seize on. And she was right. But recusing himself meant stepping aside, surrendering the chance to confront the very system that had put him face first against cold steel. By 9 o'clock, sharp, the courtroom was packed. Word had spread quickly, and courtroom 5C was standing room only. Reporters filled the back rows, community members pressed into the aisles, officers sat in clusters, uniforms pressed tight as armor. The air carried a charge, the kind of anticipation before thunder splits the sky. All rise, the bailiff called. Whitaker stepped onto the bench robe draped across his shoulders, face composed, though his heart pounded beneath. His gaze swept the room, settling on the defense table. There they were, Kincaid and Mercer. Last night's enforcers now seated like anxious defendants. Kincaid's square jaw clenched tight, his eyes flicking up only once before fixing on the table. Mercer sat stiffer, his complexion pale, his hands knotted in front of him. Their union attorney, Maxwell Gordon, a silver-haired man in an immaculate suit, whispered furiously in their ears. Whitaker raised his gavel and struck once. Be seated. The shuffle of bodies echoed. He arranged his files with deliberate care, every motion reminding him he controlled the pace, the rhythm, the authority in this room. Before he could begin, Gordon rose, adjusting his cufflinks with theatrical precision. Your Honor, before any proceedings, the defense moves for your immediate recusal from this case. A ripple of murmurs moved through the gallery. Whitaker's expression didn't shift. State your grounds. Gordon approached the podium, voice smooth but forceful. Judicial Canon 3 is clear, Your Honor. A judge must disqualify himself when his impartiality might reasonably be questioned. You had a personal encounter with my clients only last night, an encounter broadcast across the nation. The appearance of impropriety alone is sufficient. Whitaker leaned forward slightly. Your objection is noted, Counselor. It will be heard formally. He turned his gaze to the prosecution's table. Ms. Lowell, does the Commonwealth join this motion? Sandra Lowell, the district attorney, stood reluctantly. Her blazer was crisp, her hair pinned in its usual severe bun. But her eyes betrayed unease. Your Honor, the state takes no formal position. However, in the interest of fairness, we acknowledge the defense's concern." Whitaker nodded once. He pivoted to the opposite table where a young public defender, Gabriela Rivera, sat beside the plaintiff Deshaun Brooks, a 24-year-old nursing assistant whose complaint had launched this case. Brooks sat with his hands folded, suit slightly too large, his expression caught between disbelief and cautious hope. Ms. Rivera, Whitaker asked. She rose, clutching her well-worn briefcase, her voice steadier than her budget suit. "Your Honor, we oppose the motion. The judiciary does not demand recusal simply because a judge has relevant knowledge. If that were true, no experienced jurist could ever hear cases in their field. The incident involving yourself and these officers is separate from Mr. Brooks's complaint, though the parallels may prove instructive." The gallery buzzed. Whitaker raised his hand, silencing the room. He took a long pause, letting the weight of the decision gather before speaking. "This court recognizes the extraordinary circumstances. However, precedent does not compel recusal in this matter. Judicial impartiality refers to fairness in judgment, not blindness to reality. My personal experience will not dictate the outcome of this case, but it does give me an unflinching understanding of the stakes. The motion for recusal is denied. The objection is preserved for the record." Gasps rippled across the courtroom. Kincaid stiffened, Gordon's jaw tightened, and Mercer's eyes darted toward the exit as though searching for escape. In the gallery, a woman whispered, "Finally!" and another voice responded, "About time." Whitaker's gavel struck once more. "We will proceed." At that moment, he felt the robe's weight transform. It was no longer simply the symbol of his office. It was armor, yes, but it was also a weapon, sharp, deliberate, forged not to wound, but to reveal. He looked directly at the defendants, the same men who had dismissed his judicial ID with a smirk, who had shoved his head into steel, who had called him suspicious. "Mr. Brooks," he said evenly, "are you prepared to proceed with your complaint today?" The young man nodded, though his voice caught in his throat. "Yes, Your Honor." "Very well." Whitaker turned to the defense table. "Mr. Gordon, your objection is on the record. We will move forward." Gordon sputtered, but the momentum had shifted. The gavel struck again, anchoring the day. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Less than 12 hours ago, 2 officers had stripped a man of his dignity, certain they would face no consequence. Now, in a twist no playwright could have scripted more tightly, they sat in judgment before the very same man, this time with cameras, community, and history watching. As the first witness was sworn, in Whitaker's mind sharpened. He had endured the humiliation. Now came the reckoning. The first to take the stand was Deshaun Brooks. He was only 24, but under the fluorescent courtroom lights, he looked older, as though the weight of nights spent replaying his arrest had carved years into his face. He straightened his borrowed tie and glanced nervously at Judge André Whitaker, then at the jury box that wasn't there. This was a bench trial, and all judgment would flow from the man who just 12 hours earlier had felt the same cold press of metal cuffs. "State your name for the record," Gabriela Rivera prompted. "Deshaun Anthony Brooks." His voice wavered but did not break. Rivera's questions were careful, deliberate. She asked him to describe March 14th, the night he was pulled over by Officers Kincaid and Mercer. He'd been driving home after a double shift at Grady Hospital, where he worked as a nursing assistant. He hadn't been speeding, hadn't run a light. Still, a patrol car trailed him for 5 blocks before flashing its lights. "They said my tail light was out," he testified, but the mechanic checked. The next morning, it wasn't broken. It never was. He spoke of how he complied with every order, keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel, asking permission before reaching for his wallet, saying "yes, sir," and "no, sir." Yet the officers escalated, dragging him from the car, accusing him of resisting, cuffing him on the hood, while neighbors filmed from porches. As Brooks described the humiliation, Whitaker's own skin prickled. He remembered the weight of Mercer's hand on his shoulder, Kincaid's voice barking stop, resisting into the night air, though he had not moved. The parallel was unmistakable. Rivera played a snippet of body cam footage. The grainy video showed Brooks standing calmly, his voice measured. "Officer, may I ask why I'm being detained?" In contrast, the written report claimed he had shouted, pulled away, clenched his fists. The discrepancy hung in the courtroom like smoke. When Rivera asked if he had ever resisted, Brooks shook his head. "No, ma'am, not once. I was tired. I just wanted to go home." The prosecution shifted uncomfortably. The defense lawyer, Gordon, objected half-heartedly, but Whitaker overruled. "Proceed," he said. Next came a surprise witness, Mr. Bao Nguyen, the gas station manager who had rushed out the night of Whitaker's arrest. He carried with him a flash drive, his hands trembling as he swore the oath. Mr. Nguyen Rivera asked, "Do you recognize these officers?" "Yes," Nguyen answered, glancing at Kincaid and Mercer. "They come to my station almost every night." Rivera paced slowly, letting the moment breathe. "And what have you observed during those visits?" Nguyen swallowed. "They target customers, especially black and Latino men. They'll ask what they're doing, where they're going, even if the person is just buying gas." Gordon objected. "Irrelevant, prejudicial." Whitaker tapped his gavel once. "Overruled. The witness may continue." Nguyen cleared his throat. "After Judge Whitaker was taken, I checked our cameras. We saved footage for 2 weeks." On March 14th, 1 hour before they pulled over, Mr. Brooks, the officers, were at my station. Rivera connected a laptop to the court's monitor. The footage flickered to life. Inside the store, under buzzing lights, Kincaid leaned on the counter sipping coffee while Mercer flipped through a rack of beef jerky. Their voices carried clearly. "Quotas not filled yet," Kincaid muttered. "Need 2 more stops before end of shift," Mercer replied. "Southside's always good for that." The words landed like a bomb. In the gallery, whispers erupted. Everyone knew what Southside meant: predominantly black and Latino neighborhoods, long considered hunting grounds for pretextual stops. Whitaker studied Kincaid's reaction. The officer's jaw-clenched eyes glued to the table. Mercer looked away, face pale. Mr. Nguyen Rivera pressed. "Why bring this forward now?" Nguyen's eyes flicked to Whitaker. "Because last night, I saw what they did to him. And I knew it was part of a pattern." The courtroom buzzed again. Whitaker's gavel cut through. Order. But the foundation had cracked. This wasn't an isolated complaint, it was a system revealed in real time. The final blow of the morning came from Officer Darius Cole. Dressed in full uniform, his posture rigid, he looked torn between loyalty and truth. When he took the oath, a hush fell over the room. Officer Cole Rivera began gently, "How long have you served with the Atlanta North Precinct?" 14 months, ma'am." "And during that time, what have you observed about stop practices?" Cole hesitated, glancing at Captain Dwyer, seated stiffly behind the defense table. Then he turned back, his voice firm. "We're told there are no quotas. Officially, but unofficially there are expectations. Performance reviews mention activity levels, stops, arrests, tickets. If your numbers are low, supervisors call you out. If they're high, you're praised." He continued, choosing his words carefully. "We're also taught to use certain phrases in our reports. Furtive movements. Matched description. Appeared nervous. They're code. Everyone knows the courts will accept them without question." A ripple of recognition moved through the courtroom. Defense attorneys in the gallery exchanged knowing looks. Community members muttered under their breath. These were the very words they'd seen in reports for years, the magic language that justified suspicion where none existed. Rivera asked, Were you given examples of when to apply these terms? Cole's jaw tightened. Yes, ma'am. We were told a black man driving a nice car in a white neighborhood is suspicious. A young man in a hoodie after dark is suspicious. A person who looks nervous when police approach is suspicious. It becomes a script. Gordon sprang to his feet. Objection, speculation, and hearsay. Whitaker's voice cut steady and sharp. Overruled. The witness is testifying to his direct training and experience. Cole looked at Whitaker, guilt flickering in his eyes. Sir, when you were brought in last night, I overheard Officer Kincaid say, "We got another one." They didn't know who you were. To them, you were just another number. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Whitaker's face remained composed, but inside heat surged in his veins. The phrase "another one" echoed like a curse, reduced not to a man, not to a judge, but to a quota tick on a tally sheet. When Rivera finished, Cole stepped down. The courtroom was electric. The defense scrambled Gordon, whispering frantically to his clients. Captain Dwyer's face flushed with tension. The blue wall was cracking piece by piece. Whitaker lifted his gavel. "This court will recess for lunch," he announced. His voice carried more than authority. It carried promise. "When we return, the defense will have its opportunity. And this court will hear every word." He struck the gavel once. The sound echoed long after the crowd rose to its feet. When the court reconvened after lunch, the air in courtroom 5C was heavier, almost suffocating. The morning's testimony still lingered like smoke body cam contradictions, Nguyen's footage of activity targets, Officer Cole's brave revelation about quotas and code words. The blue wall was cracking, and everyone in the room could feel it. On one side of the gallery, community members leaned forward, eyes sharp with hope. On the other, officers whispered in tight clusters, their folded arms less confident than before. Judge André Whitaker returned to the bench with his robe draped like armor, his face unreadable. He knew what was coming next, would either rip the case wide open or see it strangled by the same silence that had shielded misconduct for decades. The defense called Officer Owen Mercer to the stand. Mercer looked uneasy, even before he sat down. His complexion was pale, his uniform collar tight around his throat, his hands knotted in front of him. He had the posture of a man already carrying regret. Officer Mercer, defense attorney Gordon began, voice slick with rehearsed calm. "Describe your actions during Mr. Brooks's stop on March 14th. Mercer's eyes darted briefly toward Whitaker before he spoke. "We initiated the stop because we believed the vehicle's tail light was defective." "And what occurred after the stop?" Gordon pressed. Mercer recited the report almost word for word. Brooks had been uncooperative. He had made furtive movements. He matched a description. But the words were hollow now, brittle, after the morning's evidence. Rivera's cross-examination came sharp. "Officer Mercer, you testified Mr. Brooks was uncooperative. Did you see the body cam footage?" "Yes," he admitted quietly. "Does it show Mr. Brooks being calm and compliant?" Mercer hesitated. "Yes, ma'am." A murmur ran through the gallery. Rivera leaned forward. "Then explain the discrepancy between your report and the video." Mercer's throat bobbed. "It's how we're trained to describe situations." "Describe or justify," Rivera shot back. Gordon objected. "Argumentative." "Overruled," Whitaker said, his voice even. "The witness will answer." Mercer exhaled. "We're told to use certain phrases. It doesn't always mean what it sounds like. Furtive movements can mean almost anything, looking around, reaching for a wallet too fast, or even just standing still if you look nervous." Rivera's voice softened, pulling him further. "And why use those phrases? Because—" Mercer's voice cracked. He lowered his eyes. "Because supervisors accept them. Courts accept them. They cover us." A rustle swept through the gallery. Whitaker's pulse thudded. He knew exactly what this was the first fracture in Mercer's silence. Rivera pressed. Officer Mercer, were you under pressure to make stops? Specifically in black neighborhoods. Mercer shifted uncomfortably. He glanced at Captain Harold Dwyer sitting stiffly behind the defense table, his jaw like stone. Mercer's lips parted, then closed again. Finally, with visible strain, he answered, "Yes, there's cultural pressure. You're praised when you stop more people, especially in certain areas." "Which areas?" "The South Side, East End, predominantly black neighborhoods." The words landed heavy, undeniable. "Was there ever instruction from your superiors to alter records of calls or stops?" Rivera asked carefully. Mercer froze. His Adam's apple bobbed again. His fingers clenched around the edges of the witness stand. He looked at Dwyer, then back at Whitaker. Sweat glistened on his brow. "There were times," he began slowly, "when Captain Dwyer told us to adjust call logs, to make it look like we had a description before a stop, to cover our bases." The gallery erupted in whispers. Reporters scribbled furiously. Whitaker raised his gavel and struck once. "Order." Mercer's words were now in the record. A captain giving direct instructions to falsify logs, no longer rogue officers, but an orchestrated system. Gordon scrambled, cutting in with rapid-fire questions to redirect. But Mercer was unraveling his earlier defense, crumbling under the weight of his conscience. Finally, Gordon ended the cross, his voice tight, with barely concealed panic. Before Rivera could call her next witness, a chair scraped loudly. Officer Brett Kincaid stood, fists clenched, face red with rage. "This is garbage!" he exploded, voice booming across the courtroom. "We're doing our jobs. If these people would just comply, instead of whining about racism all the damn time." Officer Kincaid, Gordon hissed, tugging at his sleeve. But Kincaid shook him off, pointing across the room at Brooks. "You think we make this stuff up? Look at him, hood up, sneaking around, probably lying about working in a hospital." "They all lie, every damn one of them." Gasps filled the courtroom. Rivera's jaw dropped. Brooks shrank in his chair, his hands trembling. Whitaker let the silence hang for a long, dangerous beat. Then he struck the gavel once, twice. "Order." His voice sliced like steel. "Officer Kincaid, your comments are now part of the record." Kincaid's chest heaved, the fire in his eyes cooling as he realized what he'd done. Gordon buried his face in his hands. Mercer looked away, disgust etched in his features. Whitaker leaned forward. Sometimes under pressure, people reveal their truest selves. "Thank you for your candor, officer." The gallery erupted with murmurs of agreement, outrage, and disbelief. Whitaker raised his hand for silence. "This court has now heard testimony that implicates not only individual officers, but patterns of conduct and possible directives from command staff. Therefore, the scope of this hearing is expanded to include departmental practices as a whole." The defense erupted in protest. Gordon nearly shouted, "Your Honor, this exceeds the bounds of this complaint. This is about Mr. Brooks, not an indictment of an entire precinct." Whitaker's voice was steady, firm. "When individual actions reveal systemic practices, the court has the obligation to examine those practices. Public interest demands nothing less." A knock at the door interrupted the mounting chaos. The bailiff whispered in Whitaker's ear, then stepped aside as a tall woman in a dark suit entered the courtroom. Police Commissioner Evelyn Sutter. The gallery gasped. Reporters leapt from their seats, cameras clicking furiously. The commissioner carried herself with the authority of a battlefield. General every step measured her gray hair, swept into a bun, her eyes scanning the room with practiced command. Whitaker addressed her directly. "Commissioner, given the testimony we have heard, this court compels your appearance. You will testify under oath to departmental policies relevant to these proceedings." Sutter's lips thinned, but she nodded. "Understood, Your Honor." The gallery roared with whispers again. In one morning, the case had transformed from a single man's complaint into a tribunal on an entire department. Officers shifted in their seats, the ground beneath their silence now unstable. Whitaker felt the gavel heavy in his hand. He struck it once more. "This court will proceed with full transparency. We are not only here to weigh one man's rights, but to confront the systems that shape those rights every day. The truth will not be walled in." And in that moment, as the commissioner prepared to take the stand, the blue wall didn't just crack. It began to crumble. The air inside courtroom 5C felt like it had thickened by the time Commissioner Evelyn Sutter finished testifying. Her carefully polished words about performance metrics and community engagement strategies had dissolved under cross-examination, leaving only the raw outlines of truth stops, tied to numbers, vague language institutionalized, and supervisors like Captain Harold Dwyer, encouraging record manipulation to protect officers and the department alike. It wasn't a handful of bad actors. It was the system itself. By the time Whitaker called for final statements, the crowd in the gallery was silent, not with boredom, but with something close to awe. They knew they were witnessing history, an unprecedented hearing where police practices, normally shielded by opaque policies and union lawyers, had been pulled into daylight. Gordon, the union attorney, gave his last plea with the precision of a surgeon sewing a wound. "Your Honor," he said, voice tight, "even if mistakes were made, they do not amount to systemic bias. My clients were acting under training and policy. Punish them, and you punish every officer doing their job under impossible conditions." Sandra Lowell, the district attorney, tried to retreat to safer ground. "The Commonwealth acknowledges troubling testimony, Your Honor, but cautions against broad rulings that interfere with executive authority." Rivera's closing was different. She didn't just argue, she told a story. Mr. Brooks followed the rules. He complied. He was cuffed anyway. Judge Whitaker himself followed the rules and was treated as a criminal. These aren't accidents, they're patterns. And patterns reveal practice. If justice means anything, it must reach beyond one man to the culture that made this possible. When the lawyers sat, all eyes turned to Whitaker. He remained still for a long moment, his hands folded, his gavel untouched. He scanned the room, Brooks staring with cautious hope, Nguyen wringing his hands, Cole sitting upright in his uniform, despite the weight of what he'd admitted. Across the aisle, Kincaid's face was tight with rage, Mercer's pale with resignation, Gordon's polished confidence worn thin. And at the back, Commissioner Sutter's eyes were narrowed, calculating the cost of what was about to unfold. Whitaker rose. His voice, when it came, filled the room like a tide. "This court has heard testimony from officers, from citizens, from experts, and from leadership. The evidence is clear. Mr. Brooks's constitutional rights were violated. The stop lacked reasonable suspicion, the arrest lacked lawful basis, and the subsequent reports were inconsistent with objective footage." A ripple of reaction moved through the gallery. Whitaker continued, steady as stone. "But the violations do not end there. We have also heard credible testimony that officers were pressured to meet unofficial quotas, encouraged to use vague coded language in reports, and instructed to alter call logs after the fact. These practices are not isolated, they are systemic. And systemic violations demand systemic remedies." He let the silence sharpen the weight of his words. Then he delivered the rulings one by one, each like a hammer blow. First officers Kincaid and Mercer are suspended without pay for 6 months pending completion of retraining in constitutional policing and implicit bias recognition. Their actions demonstrated disregard for rights they swore to uphold. Kincaid slammed a fist onto the defense table. Gordon hissed at him to sit still. Mercer closed his eyes, shoulders sinking. Second Whitaker went on the testimony regarding Captain Dwyer's instructions to manipulate call logs constitutes potential criminal conduct. This matter is referred to the District Attorney's Office for criminal review. The gallery gasped. Dwyer's face drained of color. For the first time in his career, he was no longer shielded by the wall of command. Third, this court mandates immediate body camera safeguards. All devices must remain active during public encounters, with footage uploaded automatically to servers accessible by civilian review. Deactivation will require documented justification, subject to independent oversight. Reporters scribbled furiously. Rivera glanced toward Brooks, a small smile flickering across her lips. Fourth Whitaker continued the department's so-called productivity metrics are abolished. Stop and arrest numbers shall not factor into performance evaluations. Constitutional compliance and community engagement will replace them as benchmarks. Officers in the gallery exchanged uneasy looks. For years, numbers had been their currency. Now, the currency was changing. Fifth, this court establishes a civilian oversight board, independent and empowered with subpoena authority, composed of community representatives and legal experts. This board shall review complaints, examine body cam footage, and recommend disciplinary action without interference from the department. The crowd erupted. Applause, cheers, voices rising. Whitaker's gavel cracked down hard. Order. This remains a court of law. But inside, he allowed himself the smallest flicker of satisfaction. And finally, he said, his voice deepening, this court orders a 3-year independent audit of all stops initiated by Atlanta North Precinct on vague pretexts such as matched description or furtive movements. Each case will be reviewed for constitutional compliance. If violations are found, remedies will be pursued, including dismissal of charges and possible compensation for those unlawfully detained. The room buzzed louder than ever. For families who had carried stories of humiliation for men and women with records built on flimsy stops, this was more than reform. It was vindication. Whitaker struck his gavel once more. The sound echoed final and sharp. Justice cannot exist without accountability. But accountability cannot stop at individuals. It must reshape the structures that allow abuse to flourish. This ruling seeks not just to punish, but to transform. That work begins today. Court is adjourned. The gallery erupted. No gavel could contain it now. Reporters bolted for the doors, phones aloft. Community members clutched each other, some in tears. Guyen bowed his head, whispering thanks. Cole sat straighter, as though a weight had been lifted. Brooks wiped at his eyes, overwhelmed by a vindication he never thought possible. At the defense table, Kincaid's fury had drained into hollow silence. Mercer looked as though he might crumble entirely. Gordon packed his briefcase with jerky, frustrated motions. Behind them, Dwyer sat frozen, realizing the story he had tried to get straight the night before had just unraveled before the world. And in the back row, Commissioner Sutter rose slowly. She was no longer the confident figure who had strode in hours earlier. She looked instead like a woman calculating the cost of rebuilding an entire department from the ground up. Whitaker removed his robe as he stepped off the bench, feeling its weight slide from his shoulders. But unlike the night before when the cuffs had stripped him of dignity, this weight he shed by choice. He walked out through the side door, head high. Outside the courthouse steps were already a sea of people, protesters, supporters, cameras, microphones. Signs read, "Justice for Brooks End, quotas, now no more, matched description." The chant rose, "Justice, now justice, now." Whitaker paused at the threshold. He knew this was only the beginning. Policy could be ordered, boards could be created, audits could be launched. But culture, he thought of Sarai's trembling voice. Malik's clenched fists culture would take longer. Yet tonight, for the first time since cold cuffs had bitten into his wrists, he felt something more powerful than rage or humiliation. He felt possibility. 6 months later, Atlanta felt different. Not perfect, not healed, but undeniably altered. What had begun in courtroom 5C with one man's humiliation and one department's reckoning had rippled outward into policy practice and perception. The changes weren't abstract. They were visible, measurable, and posted for all to see. Every month, the Atlanta North Precinct now published a public dashboard, charts and numbers stripped of jargon posted online and pinned to community boards in libraries and churches. The latest report showed a 40% decline in discretionary stops, those vague pretextual encounters justified by furtive movements or matched descriptions. And yet the city's crime rate hadn't spiked, as critics had warned. In fact, major categories like burglary and aggravated assault had held steady or even ticked slightly downward. For residents who had long believed harassment did nothing for safety, the data was a vindication written in black and white. At precinct roll calls, the culture had begun to shift. Officers no longer dreaded monthly reviews that tallied up stops like points in a game. Instead, they were evaluated on measures like de-escalation, success, community engagement hours, and constitutional compliance. Those words, once treated as empty bureaucratic boxes, now meant the difference between advancement or disciplinary review. For Officer Darius Cole, the young man who had once trembled as he recognized Judge Whitaker at booking the shift, was personal. He had been promoted to lead the newly created Community Relations Division. His days were now spent organizing youth forums, meeting with neighborhood leaders, and reviewing body cam footage, not as punishment, but as teaching material. Cole wore the promotion with humility, often recalling the night he spoke truth in court, when silence would have been safer. "It's not about me," he told a group of cadets at the academy. "It's about making sure what happened to Judge Whitaker or to Deshaun Brooks never happens on your watch." Brooks himself had begun a new chapter. With the settlement he received for his unlawful arrest, he enrolled at Georgia State University to study criminal justice. At 25, he was both student and activist, speaking on panels about reform, balancing night classes with volunteer work at legal aid clinics. When asked why he chose this path, he said simply, "Because I know what it feels like to be on the hood of that car, and I don't want anyone else to live it." As for the officers at the heart of the scandal, their paths diverged. Mercer completed his 6-month suspension and returned after mandatory retraining. Gone was the stiff, uncertain officer who once parroted code words in reports. He now mentored rookies on how to write clear factual accounts and why respecting constitutional limits wasn't weakness, but strength. Some colleagues doubted his sincerity, muttering that he was just protecting his career. But others, especially younger officers, listened. They saw a man who had crossed a line and then faced it. "I messed up," Mercer told them plainly. "Don't repeat my mistakes." Kincaid's journey was harder. His courtroom outburst, his venomous words about these people had burned deep scars. Public trust in him was shattered. Yet instead of termination, the court had ordered remediation, a grueling program of counseling, bias training, and community service under direct supervision. He hated it at first, railing at what he saw as humiliation. But time wore him down. Cleaning streets with neighborhood teenagers, sitting through sessions where residents described their fear of police, hearing Brooks himself speak about trauma, it cracked something open. He wasn't reformed overnight. Real change, was slow and jagged. But for the first time in his career, Kincaid was being forced to see through someone else's eyes. Commissioner Evelyn Sutter, once cornered and exposed on the stand, now chaired monthly oversight meetings with the Civilian Board. The board had subpoena power and used it, pulling body cam clips, reviewing stops, issuing public reports. The relationship was tense, combative at times, but it was transparent. For communities long accustomed to secrecy, that transparency mattered more than polished speeches. And Judge André Whitaker. He had returned to his bench each morning with the same black robe, but with a new weight in his steps. The bruises on his wrists had long since faded, but the memory of that night at the gas station never did. He carried it into every ruling, every case, where the balance of rights and power hung precariously. He became a symbol, not because he sought it, but because people saw in him the rare convergence of victim and arbiter, the man who lived the injustice and then wielded the gavel against it. One warm evening in late September, Whitaker stopped again at the SoCo station where it had all begun. The air smelled faintly of gasoline and fried chicken from the deli counter inside. He pulled up to pump number 3, slipped his card in, and let the nozzle click into place. For a moment, the fluorescent lights above flickered, and a memory slammed back the glare of headlights. The bark of orders, the sudden slam of his cheek against cold steel. But then a voice cut through the memory. A young officer, maybe 23, stepped out of a cruiser parked nearby. He approached a stranded car where a black teenager stood with the hood-popped open phone in one hand, backpack slung over the other shoulder. Whitaker stiffened instinctively, watching. The officer didn't reach for his holster. He didn't bark commands. He introduced himself by name. "You need a hand," he asked, his tone light, even kind. The teenager nodded, relief washing over his face. Together they leaned over the engine flashlights, cutting through the twilight. After a few minutes, the car sputtered back to life. The officer clapped the teen on the shoulder, wished him luck on his drive home, and walked back to his cruiser. Whitaker exhaled slowly. It was nothing extraordinary, a simple assist, a routine act. Yet in that ordinary moment, he saw extraordinary progress. The culture hadn't shifted because of speeches or slogans. It shifted because systems and incentives had been rewired, because officers like Cole and Mercer now taught a different script, because oversight meant accountability, because quotas no longer rewarded harassment. And slowly, one stop, one interaction at a time, the daily rhythm of policing began to change. As Whitaker screwed the gas cap back into place, he caught the teenager's eye across the lot. They exchanged a nod, a quiet acknowledgement of something fragile but real, the possibility of safety without suspicion, respect without fear. Driving home, Whitaker reflected on the past 6 months. He knew the work was unfinished. Skeptics still doubted, old habits still lingered, and reform was never a straight road. But tonight, for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that better wasn't just possible, it was happening. And for a man who had once been reduced to another one in the eyes of the system, that belief was everything. The story of Judge André Whitaker is more than a courtroom drama, it's a mirror held up to America. In one night at a gas station, we saw how centuries of prejudice can still collapse dignity in seconds. In one courtroom, over 9 long months, we watched how courage, truth, and accountability can begin to bend the arc of justice back toward fairness. The lesson for every American citizen is simple, but urgent rights are only as strong as our will to defend them, and systems only change when ordinary people demand it. When Deshaun Brooks was cuffed on the hood of his car, when Whitaker's children watched their father humiliated on viral video, when Officer Cole risked his career to tell the truth, each moment revealed the same truth. Silence protects abuse. Voices create reform. 6 months later, dashboards showed 40% fewer discretionary stops and no spike in crime. That didn't happen because the system woke up one morning kinder. It happened because people refused to let the story die. Because evidence was shared. Because outrage turned into oversight, and oversight turned into action. The lesson for us is this one ruling can spark reform, but real transformation requires every voice. If you are a parent, teach your children not just how to stay safe, but how to demand safety with dignity. If you are a voter, push your city councils, mayors, and legislators to insist on oversight boards with subpoena power. If you are an officer, remember that protecting rights is not weakness, it is the highest form of strength. And if you are a citizen, never forget that every camera phone, every testimony, every demand for data is a tool of democracy. This story isn't just about Atlanta, it's about every town where someone is told they matched a description, every city where stops are tallied like scores, every neighborhood where a hoodie is seen as a threat. Now, the question is, what will you do? Will you let the blue wall of silence stand, or will you help crack it open further? If you believe justice belongs to everyone, then take one simple step. Right now, subscribe to this channel, hit that like button, and share this video with your community. Because when these stories spread, change spreads too. And America cannot afford to wait another day.